Welcome to the Mipar tutorial on chapters. Chapters were introduced as a recipe feature back in version 1.3.0, and in this tutorial we will be reviewing how chapters can be of great help in clarifying the purpose and improving the readability of a recipe. So we'll begin in the image processor, and for this tutorial we will work with a short example of an image of a weld bead cross-section with heat-affected zones, where we will want to measure, say, the area fraction of the heat-affected zones relative to this circular area of interest, not relative to the entire image. And chapters can be very useful in breaking up how we approach this particular problem. So to begin, let's just start with a quick threshold, and we'll choose some of the brighter portion of the image. This is a selection of, or a rough selection of our area of interest. We could then add a smoothing step where we smooth out some of this roughness here. And then perhaps we may want to add an erosion step if you want to play with the position of this boundary out here. So let's suppose we did something like this. So now here are the three steps that we've used to select our area of interest. If you're interested in looking at how some of these steps might be optimized to have Mipar automatically select their parameters, check out our optimization tutorial. And what we now want to do is go back to not a selection image like we have here, but a intensity image or a grayscale image to start targeting the heat affected zones. So you'll see that when we go up to memory and we choose call original image, which will bring back the original grayscale state, Mipar automatically sets this step as a new chapter, supposing that you are now pausing on the area of interest work and you're now going off in a different direction with your recipe to select the heat affected zone. So it's smart enough to know based on certain steps that you add when you might be going after a new chapter. Now, I'll pause at this point to explain how, well, let's finish off the selection here, and then we'll review how to manipulate chapters. So let's suppose that we just added a top hat filter here, which highlights the bright features of highly textured areas. Then we may do some smoothing, perhaps a Gaussian blur, to blur some of the heat affected zones together. And then we may do a threshold to select those brighter regions. Lastly, we may do a cleanup step to remove small artifacts, and perhaps add a convex hull replacement to smooth out the shapes of these heat affected zones. So now that could be a potential heat affected zone selection. You may not want to add that smoothing step at the end, but it is of course an option. So here we now have a two chapter recipe where we have one series of steps that selects our area of interest. We have another series of steps that eventually selects our heat affected zones. We could certainly set these as layers if we wish for easier visibility and enhancements to one-click quantification capabilities. So let's say that we started and set our area of interest layer here in green, and then we might take our heat affected zone selection and set it in red. And now we've co-visualized both of those together. We can show them as an outline if we wish, or an overlay. You can hide these layers as you will or have seen in the layers tutorial. And you see that by naming those layers or setting those layers, Mipar has automatically named the associated chapter the same way. So this can be a time saver and an automator in helping you name your chapters according to the layers that they go after. Now, you can always change these names. So you noticed before we set these layers, the names were start and new chapter, the first step of a recipe is always the beginning of chapter 1, and that always gets the name start by default. Subsequent chapters get the name new chapters. Of course, their names get set based on layers that you might set within, but we can always change these names. So you can right click on a layer step and hit edit chapter, and perhaps you may want to rename this to something else. You can add or set any step as a chapter. So if you didn't want this as a chapter for some reason, simply remove it. You can add it back. You can add another step as a chapter if you want. So you could break this up further if you want and say that this chapter is for accentuating heat affected zones. And then down at this point is where you begin your selection of heat affected zones. Now, in combination with notes on a particular step, where you can type any particular custom notes for what this step might be doing, in combination with flags, where you can set a particular step as important to remind yourself it's significant, in combination with layers, where you give critical steps names, chapters add a wonderful way to break up the higher level workflow of your detection. They have been added throughout our recipe store recipes, so those are now much more readable at first glance. And we hope you enjoy the new enhancements that they bring to the recipe experience. So that is all for chapters. Thanks for your attention, and we will see you next time.